You need to know something. You know something about the stature of a speaker by how much needs to be said about him to introduce him. The greater his stature, the less that needs to be said. And so I'll be very brief tonight. Ambassador Mark Johnson, U.S. Foreign Service retired, is National Vice Chair of the World Affairs Councils of America, housed in Washington, D.C. His 30-year career in diplomatic service included posting as Deputy Chief of Mission to Kuwait. He served in that post in 1991 when the government of Kuwait resided in exile in Taif, Saudi Arabia. He was the first U.S. diplomat to enter liberated Kuwait at the conclusion of Operation Desert Storm. He remains very much in touch with the region, and if you ask, after his remarks, he will share with you his own first-hand insights, not only about Egypt, but about Iran, Israel, and Syria. If you press him, he may even predict the Arab country in which President Obama will make his major policy address. Please welcome to West Michigan, Ambassador Mark Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Gellman. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And also thank you for the good work you do with the Great Decisions program. I am a big supporter of that. It has turned out to be an invaluable tool for university students, certainly, but also for high school students as well. So, again, thanks for all that you do. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, a chance for me to catch up with your friend and colleague, your very own Dixie Anderson, and two other very special people, Gretchen and Louise, with whom I had the privilege of traveling. If you ever travel anywhere, make sure you travel with Gretchen and Louise, because it is a great joy to be with them. We had such a good time. I want to plunge directly into my talk. I'm going to begin in a rather peculiar way, if you don't mind. I'm going to tell you about a talk I gave at the World Affairs Council of Palm Beach, Florida, last January. And the way I started that talk, I'll share with you. I said to the audience, I want to address immediately at what I know is the top question on your minds. You're all asking yourselves, how is it that a guy from Montana comes to Florida to talk to us about the Middle East? I said, well, I have a pretty simple answer, one word, January. And I think they understood that. And I realized I can't use that answer here in Grand Rapids, although the weather today is very nice. But I have a better answer for being here. And it has to do with my service on the National Board of the World Affairs Councils of America, and particularly as Vice Chairman. And in that capacity, I had the opportunity to learn about, to witness the work of councils across the United States. We have 90 now. And it was clear to me that one council that always earned distinction was this very Council of Western Michigan. It had the vision, the energy, the dynamism to do things that very few other councils in the country could do. And so I want to congratulate you for that, and also tell you what a privilege it is for me to be here with such a fine council. And in the same light, I also want to tell you that one of the top executives, leaders of the council system is your very own Dixie Anderson. She brings imagination and energy and wisdom and leadership, the likes of which we do not see in the council system. So it's been a great pleasure to have worked with here. Now, many people will speak about the importance of the work that a council does. I disagree. It's not important. It's more. It's a duty. The greatest tragedy facing the United States, in my view, would be if the United States, having globalized the rest of the world with McDonald's hamburgers and Madonna videos, failed to globalize itself. You're doing the right stuff, and I hope our other councils can be halfway as good as you are. I've just come back from Egypt. I was there about a week and a half ago. Egypt, to me, is the heart and soul of the Arab world. I love Egypt. I'm particularly fond of Cairo. Cairo is now a city of 22 million. The last time I was there a year ago, they said it was 18 million. I don't know where the other 4 million came from, but it's a big city. And while it seems noisy and loud and chaotic,
It really has a charm. The only thing I don't like about Cairo is the traffic. The traffic is treacherous and deadly. I don't know if any of you have been to Cairo recently, but you walk on the streets at great peril. Now, I'll give you an example of what it's like. There was a man in Midtown Manhattan once on Lexington Avenue. He got in a taxi cab. The driver was Egyptian, and off they went. The man was horrified because the Egyptian kept running every red light. He said, "What are you doing?" The man turned to him and said, "Well, in Cairo, we don't stop for red lights. Red means go faster." They came to a green light, and he stopped inexplicably. And the man said, "What are you doing? It's a green light." He said, "I know. There might be another Egyptian cab driver out there." Before I move into the substance of my talk, there are 2 points that I always make. In fact, I insist on making them whenever I talk about the Middle East. The first point is that notwithstanding the headlines and the apocalyptical images that we see every day surrounding the Middle East, please remember that at the heart of this region are the people. And the people are wonderful. The people give it its value. When I was in Egypt, what I've discovered was that the hospitality that I received is not just generous or lavish, it's overwhelming. Last April, I was in Iran, in Bandar Abbas, the ancient port city. I had a conversation with a woman, high school teacher, taught English to her students. And we had a fine conversation, and what was remarkable about that conversation was absolutely nothing. It was just two people talking. We should resist the tendency or the temptation to demonize the people, for they want in their lives exactly what we want in our lives. Now, the second point I would make about the Middle East is that we need a lot of patience to deal with the Middle East. It is not a light switch that we can turn on or off. It is not a Law and Order episode that comes to a neat conclusion in 1 hour. And we like to say, well, let's move on. Let's put this behind us. Water under the bridge and so forth. Well, in the Middle East, they have long memories and a sense of history. Tonight I want to examine the title, Is Egypt Declining? Is Egypt still the top Arab leader? And I think the best way for me to do that is to meld Egypt's international role and stance with some of its domestic issues and indeed problems. Why does Egypt matter? A couple of quick points. First, Egypt is the face of Arab cultural and religious identity. The last Arab Nobel laureate for literature was an Egyptian, the great writer Naguib Mahfouz. If you haven't read any of his writings, I urge you to do so. The Cairo trilogy, a very rich and dense look at life in Cairo of a certain era. The Thief and the Dog, when I was speaking at the World Affairs Council in South Dakota, they had selected Mahfouz's The Thief and the Dog as their great read, and we had a lot of fun discussing that. Al-Azhar University in Egypt is said to be the oldest indeed the oldest university in the world, the Islamic center of learning there. Egypt is also the source of modern political development in the Arab world. By that I mean secular parties, as we would describe them, started in Egypt. For example, the Wafd Party, the venerable anti-colonialist party, started in Egypt at the turn of the century. So too have the Islamist parties all started in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood, which I'm sure you have heard of. Hamas in Gaza is the Palestinian version of the Muslim Brotherhood, a very powerful voice in Egypt and throughout the Arab world. I will say more on that later. Egypt has the Arab world's largest military, and that has been helpful as an ally during Desert Storm. The Egyptian forces proved themselves many times over. Egypt has been active in peacekeeping operations around the world, and Egypt is a force throughout the Arab world. finally, the point I would make why Egypt matters is that it is the center of diplomacy, the center of Arab and regional diplomacy. They've been at it for a long time, about 3,500 years. When you go to the temple of Karnak in Luxor, you will see inscribed on the wall in the ancient script the world's first peace treaty. They've been negotiating ever since, and they have a lot of success and can help us a great deal as we try and struggle with common problems. The answer to the question, is Egypt still the top player in the Middle East? And the honest answer is no. Egypt has receded in recent years, and there are a couple of reasons for that. The internal political scene is one. Questions about the economy a problem. There's an issue in today's Egypt about who succeeds President Hosni Mubarak. That's starting to weigh on people's minds. And then there's Iran. The tensions generated by Iran have created an entirely new dynamic in this region. That is the most startling development that I have seen in the last 2 years. And I think another reason for this, I'll use the word decline, but I think that's putting it too strongly, for this changed stance is the faltering relationship, if I may put it this way, between Egypt and the United States. It's not good. It's not good at the top. I have every reason to believe that it will get better. Indeed, it has already gotten better, and that's a very positive thing. So with that kind of framework, let me turn to some of the internal factors that I think affect Egypt's ability to be, quote, the top player in the Middle East. Politics in Egypt today are stressed and repressed. Power is centralized, monopolized is probably a better word, in the hands of President Hosni Mubarak and his ruling party, the NDP, the National Democratic Party. Now, in 2005, when I was in Egypt, there was a moment of hope and optimism. I was sitting literally as part of a World Affairs Council delegation in the office of the Prime Minister, Ahmed Nassif, a very impressive man, a technocrat who has been Prime Minister since 2004. And as we were in his office, literally, word came down from the presidency that Egypt's constitution would be amended to allow other candidates to stand for office in the upcoming presidential election. Now, you may shrug and say, well, what's that all about? Well, the fact is that's never happened before in Egypt's modern political history. So, on the surface and at first glance, this was a historic event. Why did Mubarak do that? You see, in the past, whoever the candidate of the ruling National Democratic Party was, the NDP, won. And it was 98, 99%. There was never any question. But now other candidates would be allowed to stand. Why did he do that? I think there were three factors that went into his calculation, Hosni Mubarak's calculation. The first was that a domestic, almost spontaneous political uprising had occurred throughout 2004 and 2005. In Egypt, it was known as kafaya, enough, meaning enough of the pharaoh, enough of the authoritarian government of Hosni Mubarak. I think the second factor was pressure from the Bush administration. This period coincided with the Bush administration's democracy initiative. Now, if we go back and put ourselves in that context, this was said to be the Arab Spring. Things were happening, good things were happening. Libya had come out from the cold, had renounced its weapons program. The Syrians had been condemned and would withdraw from Lebanon. In Lebanon, we saw the seeds of the Cedar Revolution. And in Egypt, we had this development with the presidential election. And there were little bits and pieces, is how I would describe it, of movement and progress, even in Saudi Arabia, believe it or not, where municipal elections would be held. Okay, you can say that's not very significant on the scheme of things, but In Saudi Arabia, things move very, very slowly. So this was a sign, and indeed in the Gulf, in places like Bahrain, Kuwait, and even in Qatar. So I think perhaps the Bush White House calculated that this would be a moment to push this agenda. I don't know. I'm not privy to their thinking. I do know that by 2006, that agenda had pretty well receded because of the difficulties in Iraq. The third factor, I think, that prompted Hosni Mubarak to move forward in this direction was the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. Let me tell you a few words about the Muslim Brotherhood, because they are a very powerful voice in Arab countries, particularly in Egypt, but they exist in Jordan, they exist in Palestine and elsewhere. There were elements at one point in Saudi Arabia. At the turn of the 20th century, the Arab world was in great turmoil politically. It was the final throes of the colonial period, and Cairo was alive with all kinds of debate and discussion about throwing the colonial powers out and moving towards some form of democracy. At the same time, society in Cairo was becoming, what we shall say politely, very decadent and very licentious, with bars and nightclubs and prostitutes. So for young men of Hassan al-Banna's time, Hassan al-Banna would be the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was a very unsettling moment. And they felt that Muslims were losing their path to God. They were losing the way, that the West was corrupting their path and their ability to behave, to be as Muslims trying to attain the path of God. And that was a very powerful force. That was an extremely powerful force that is very much with us today when we think about some of the even more radical Muslim movements in the area. So that was some of the background. Now, what happened? The presidential election came and went in the fall of 2005. No big surprise, Mubarak won, perhaps 88% of the vote. A couple of other candidates secured a few votes. And it was sort of, okay, been there, done that type of thing. But then in the succeeding parliamentary elections for the 450-plus seats, that's when things began to go very, very bad, very sour. There were 3 rounds, and the ruling party began to see that they were in trouble, that the Muslim Brotherhood was going to succeed in capturing a large number of seats. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is a religious organization. They cannot run as a political party, so they label themselves independents. In 2000, in the last election, they had gained a number of seats. And the concern was if the NDP didn't get its act together, the Brotherhood would gain even more in 2005. And they started to in the first round, the second round. By the time the third round came around, the government resorted to some very heavy-handed tactics of manipulation, coercion, and even fraud. At the end of the day, the ruling party had lost about 90 seats. The Muslim Brotherhood had gained about 90 seats, or about 20%. A major event in Egypt's domestic politics. Now, what happens next in the parliamentary elections is that candidates will have, unless the government figures out some way to amend the Constitution, we're probably going to see more of the same. There was a last round of elections, local elections for 50,000 some seats, not significant in and of themselves, but the way that the Egyptians rewrote the Constitution with their 2007 amendments. If you want to be a candidate now for presidency in the 2011 election, and you are a regular party, you have to have been a party in existence for 5 years. Your leader has to have been a leader for a year, and you have to have 3% of the members of the upper and lower house, which is about 25 seats. Only one party now can cross that threshold, and that's the National Democratic Party. The independent party, which the Muslim Brotherhood is in a different category, and their hurdle is even higher. They have to have 250 votes, supporters from the two houses, and then something like 140 from these local councils, and that's why these municipal elections mattered so much. Now, that's a bit of internal political history in Egypt. On the one hand, when the news first came out, we saw it as a major development, a significant change. But as the process unfolded and we got into the parliamentary elections by late fall of 2005, we were back into the same kind of dilemma. Now, what happens next? What happens next in Egypt? Hosni Mubarak will turn 81 in May. He has been in power since 1981, since his predecessor, Anwar Sadat, was assassinated. By the way, that's an interesting story. You recall, some of you will recall the historic moment when President Jimmy Carter stood at the White House between Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. This is known as the Camp David Peace Agreement of 1979. We all thought it was a good thing. 2.5 years later, approximately, Sadat would be assassinated. Sadat would be assassinated by Arab militants, rejectionists, implacably opposed to the state of Israel. And that's at that point, Hosni Mubarak came forward. Now, you do not go up to a friend, a casual friend in Egypt, and say, "Well, what's going to happen in the next election? Do you think the president will step down? This is a taboo subject." All right, so I just advise you, if you're in Cairo, you're probably not going to get an answer that you would like to get. But I'll try and tell you what I think is going to happen to the best of my ability. There are 4 possibilities, and I'll go through them quickly. First of all, the other opposition parties. That's a possibility. I think their chances are slim and none. What has happened in Egypt is that the secular parties, these historic, noble parties, I would say, have been crushed, almost to the point of extinction. They make noises, they talk, they speak in favor of democracy, but they fight among themselves. They have little or no support within the Egyptian body politic. Well, you say, Egypt, you just told us Egypt has the largest army. What about the military? What about a military coup? I don't see that happening in the Egyptian context. The army has become very introverted. There are no signs of an overt political presence. Even a person that most people talk about, General Omar Suleiman, who is, his official title is Chief of Intelligence, but he's the main broker. He's the one who negotiates between Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah and all these other parties. I don't see him rising to the occasion. The Muslim Brotherhood also has its flaws. While they do have a great deal of popularity, they have internal splits. They have a demographic or generational split between the young Turks and the old guard. And actually the roles are reversed. It's the old guard who are the more radical. It's the young Turks who want to come up, get things done, enter somehow in some fashion into the body politic, and make even further gains in the next election. In September of 2007, the Muslim Brotherhood issued a manifesto, their plan for political action. And it turned off as many Egyptians as it convinced, because they talked about heavy elements of an Islamic theocratic, at least that's how many Egyptians, a theocratic Iranian-style government. You would have a senior religious council who would vet decisions by the parliament and the Supreme Court. And this does not set well with a very secular society. In fact, there's a joke about Egyptian men go to the coffee shop and they drink coffee in the course of the day, and they complain about their wives, they complain about the government. At night they go home and go to bed with each one. So change is not something that the Egyptians are comfortable with. They have followed, like many people in the world, the Obama candidacy and now the Obama presidency, and they're fascinated by it. But if you ask them, could that happen in Egypt? No. They get very nervous about the thought of that sudden and dramatic change. That brings us to the last possibility, the one that is the most sensitive. That is the son of President Hosni Mubarak, Gamal Mubarak. He, it is said, is being groomed to take over. I think it's quite likely. I think it's quite possible. This causes problems among Egyptians who say, what are we, another form of Syria? Or are we like Libya, where Gaddafi's son may become the president? I happen to think he's a very impressive person. I've met him. He's charismatic, and to my eyes, he seems like he would be a good fit or a good candidate. But my eyes or not Egyptian eyes, all right? And I think that there are some questions. But I think this preference for stability, this craving for stability, not liking change, will work in favor of Gamal Mubarak's ascendancy. President Mubarak, the elder's term ends in 1981. I'm sorry, in 2011. And there's a long time between now and then. So this question of internal politics, this question of what happens next, is very much on the minds of the Egyptian. At the senior power level, the senior decision-making level, I think this has taken some of the energy out of Egypt's traditional foreign engagement. Now, economics, not normally a topic of great interest, but I think we have to say a word or two about it. It is in the economic and social arena where the Islamist forces have made big inroads. They point to the governments, the authoritarian governments, and say, these guys can't fix your schools, these guys can't give you clean water, these guys can't even build a health clinic. We, the Muslim Brotherhood, or Hamas to be more specific, can do that. And this gains them a lot of standing on the street, the Arab street, among the population. Well, the government, the Egyptian government, realized this, and aided by the Prime Minister and Gamal Mubarak, I must say, a new generation of leaders came in. They opened up the economy. Minister of Finance said, I came in, I said, bring me the tax code. They had this old Nasser-era state. I mean, think about we're going through this problem with our tax code here. This is what Yusuf Boutros Ghali did. He took the tax code. He said, is that it? Is that all of it? They said, yes, sir, that's the entire tax code. And it was just mounds of paper. He said, good, open a window, throw it out. And he instituted a flat tax rate. Now, this is very interesting. He said to us, and he said, I didn't sleep. I wasn't sure if revenues would go up or down. I was worried to death. Would I be fired? He said revenues the next year went up 13%. This is a little example of the openness, and I think, as Gamal Mubarak said at the National Democratic Party Congress, where I was an international observer, said to the audience, this is a big wager. We know what we're doing. We know we have to deliver, not for the guys and men and women in Cairo, but in Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. And until this point, they were on to something. Last year's growth rate was 7%, until this point. Egypt is Exhibit A for the global recession. All right? Cotton production is down 50%. When I went into the Luxor parking lot, an area that is normally filled with tour buses, there were 6 or 8. Normally there would be 50 buses there. Suez Canal receipts are down for a couple of reasons. One, there isn't a lot of international shipping. And two, these miserable pirates in Somalia have scared off a lot of shipping. And the IMF projects the growth rate will be 3.5%. That's a significant cut. So this could bring back some of these tensions that the government is worried about. Now, those are some of the domestic factors that I think have restrained the government of Egypt and its external diplomacy. Now, let's turn now specifically to the foreign policy side. I want to share with you a conversation I had with Boutros Ghali, who was then Minister of State and later became Secretary General of the United Nations. And for not being a very good conversationalist, I said to him, Mr. Minister, what are the most important countries for Egypt? What do you think he said? This audience participation. What do you think he said? What are the most important countries for Egypt? U.S., Saudi, Israel. Good answers, all wrong. You know what he said? Uganda and Ethiopia. You know why? We could play Jeopardy. We could do geography for 60. Which countries do the 2 branches of the Nile originate in? In other words, water is of the most fundamental importance to Egypt. This helps explain, I think, why Hosni Mubarak has been in southern Sudan. It may, I don't have complete facts here, but it may explain why Egypt, the Arab League, and the Egyptian government have condemned the decision by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to file a warrant against Sudan's President Bashir. And the reason is the white and the blue Nile come together in Sudan, specifically in Khartoum. And I think The Egyptians don't want, this is life or death. You go to Egypt, you see 98% of the country, 95% of the country is brown. And then there's a band, it's like an artery that's pulsing with blood. That's literally their lifeblood. So those two countries, and it's wise not to forget. The chief benefit of Egypt's foreign policy, even now, this is, I think, a significant point, is that Egypt can speak and does speak with everyone. Everyone. Talk to the Israelis, they do it all the time. Now, the peace with Israel has been at times frosty, chilly, cold, Arctic, glacial, you get the point. And as an Egyptian once said to me, he said, we like the Israelis that much, he went, and then he said, but we like peace that much, which is a good illustration, unless you try and do this on public radio, and it doesn't really work very well for you. Egypt talks to everyone. They talk to Hamas. They don't like Hamas. I'll say a word about that in just a moment. They talk to Hezbollah. They don't like them either. And they talk to the other Arabs. And they talk to the European Union. They talk to the Iranians. This is a very bitter, strained relationship. When Sadat was assassinated, the perpetrator of that assassination was an Iranian soldier named Khalid Islambuli. His name means nothing except that the Islamic government of Iran named a street in downtown Tehran in his honor. And I think you get a sense why these relations are not what they should be, shall we say. U.S. relations. What are the relations between Egypt and the U.S. like? I think they're good on the operational level, that is to say on military-to-military arrangements, Suez Canal, joint exercises. In fact, I think they work quite well. Where they break down and where there are tensions and strains, first is in a lack of any shared vision. The Egyptians complained that all the administration wanted to talk about was human rights, and Egypt's complaints about various things such as Iraq, which is quite true. The Egyptians say, yeah, you're right. We told you about Iraq. We told you were making a mistake. They did. But the interesting thing is, up to a certain point, Egypt probably trained more of the Iraqi soldiers or police officers than any other country in the Arab world. The real problem, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to reveal any confidences, I'm just going to tell you the way it is there has been a very strong friction between President Mubarak and President Bush. Now, throughout the campaign, we heard a lot of talk from various candidates on one side saying, if we are elected, we will repair relations. We will restore relationships. And a lot of that was campaign rhetoric. I'll be quite, in my sense, in my experience. Where it hit the mark was with Egypt. The most significant country diplomatically in the Arab world. Mubarak complains. Hosni Mubarak has not been to Washington in 6 years. Oh, by the way, he's going to Washington in April. He's going to Washington in April. Now, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, was in Egypt last week. She met with President Mubarak. She met with the foreign minister. The president, remember Gamal Mubarak? Guess where he's been? Washington, D.C. Do you want a kind of a clue as to where the president might make his first speech in the Arab world on Islam or relations with the Arab world? I think that out of this will come an Obama visit to Cairo. If it isn't Cairo, I would guess that it would be Amman, Jordan. And the reasoning for that is that it will be a country in the Arab world that has some semblance of a relationship with Israel. It won't be in Israel. It won't be in Saudi Arabia. Turkey was just ruled out a few days ago. All right? So the answer to the question is, yes, influence has been waning for these domestic reasons, for the foreign policy reasons. Now, let me conclude by talking about one significant event that has really rocked that part of the world. It has to do with Gaza. You're familiar with the situation there. You've seen these dreadful pictures. Families in Israel, families in Sidra being bombed by Grad missiles. families in Khan Yunis being bombed by Israeli planes, and frankly, it's an escalation to nowhere. This goes back to the year 2006. Ariel Sharon had withdrawn from Gaza, the first prime minister to ever do so, to willingly, voluntarily give up occupied territory. Palestine had an election. Hamas won. They went on a very skillful campaign, by the way. They used modern political tactics to win. 2007, there was an uprising, and Hamas took over complete control of Gaza. Late in 2007, we had the border breached, and hundreds of thousands of people crossed through that barrier, went into Egypt, and put a great deal of pressure. And then we had the war between Hamas and Israel, December 27th until January 17th or 18th. This put enormous pressure on Egypt. Egypt, on the one hand, was torn between its genuine interest and affection for the Palestinian people and its own self-preservation. Now, what I think was happening is that an Egyptian once told me, he said, you know, we got rid of the Israelis in Gaza. They said, now look what we've got. The Iranians. You are watching Iran move swiftly and skillfully to establish a significant beachhead in an area, I would add, that is not traditionally of their religious interest. The Palestinians of Gaza are Sunni. The Iranians are Shia. There's a whole religious issue here we could talk about later. That's not an area where you would think that they would be strong, but they are. And I think they are using it, this is my view, only my view, as a beachhead to continue fomenting this instability against Egypt. Now, I think Egypt was worried about that. I think today there is a sense of pushback, and I thought Mubarak handled it about as well as he could have in pushing back against Hamas, saying the right words at some time and the wrong, harsh words against Israel at other times. So it's hard to know, really, should you be optimistic or pessimistic about Egypt? It's a difficult time. I have a nagging feeling that this economic crisis is going to play out in a very harmful way. I think that Egypt's reticence over the last 3 or 4 years, I think, is over, and they will start to come back. We are seeing signs of that. So I think they will emerge as the leader, because there is no other country in the Arab world that can do what Egypt does, that can speak to all the parties. Yes, the Saudis have a lot of oil money, for sure. No doubt about it, that the Egyptians don't have. But the Saudis don't speak to Egypt. Let me conclude again with a little story, and then I'd be delighted to take your questions. When I get pessimistic about Egypt, my friends always say, well, Mark, don't forget, when Moses started, he was a basket case. So let me end actually the way I began, by thanking you again for this wonderful invitation. It is such a pleasure and joy to be here, such an honor to be here at this fine council. So, as you heard John say, I can't see too well in the light, so we'll try and do the best with your questions.
Let me mention something to all of you. We first want to talk a bit about Iran, and if you want a fascinating tour and visit to Iran, which would be quite an unusual vacation, I would think. Mark is leading a trip with our World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, which is our travel program through our council, but he's leading a trip in September to Iran. And we have information on that trip out in the lobby in case you're interested. I bet that Tomatis is planning on going with him. Mark is, as you can imagine by his presentation, a lot of fun to travel with.
Thank you. Thank you, Dixie.
Good evening, sir.
I hear a voice. Oh, there. Yes, I see. I'm so sorry. I can't do a better job at identifying people.
We hear a lot of talk in the media about the Iranian development of nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons program, uranium enrichment, etc. What do you estimate to be the likelihood of a scenario where Iran goes nuclear and then Egypt and Saudi Arabia follow?
Well, the latter part's the easiest. One of the harmful aspects of Iran's vocal belligerency is that it has sparked a copycat approach in the Arab world. I happen to have been in the chamber room, the assembly hall, at the National Democratic Party Congress when Gamal Mubarak said to the assembled delegates, and Egypt will develop its own nuclear energy program. And he brought the house down. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting that it will cross the threshold into a weaponization, but the mere fact, I think, gives you a sense of what's at play. The Jordanians have said the same thing. I'm certain to within about 98% that the Saudis have undertaken quiet programs. I mean, they certainly have the cash to do so, and they can hire the expertise. Now, Iran's plans for nuclear energy are long-standing and legitimate. All right, I do not wish for anyone to think that I'm saying to the contrary, because I was involved with those programs when I was on the Iran desk at the U.S. State Department just before the revolution and the hostages. This all from February '79 to November '79. I was involved, and I was trying to promote exports on behalf of General Electric and Westinghouse. It was delicate because we had two worthy contenders, and you had to kind of be even-handed. So this is a long-standing. Moreover, it makes some economic sense. If I asked you a question, which country in the world imports more gasoline than any other country in the world, you would not guess Iran. But they do, 40%. So they need another source of it. Their refineries are decrepit and antiquated, and so they have to bring in refined product. Now, to the very issue of the bomb. Iran has currently 4 channels for enriching uranium into U-235 or fissile material. And I can go through each one of them, but I'm going to take a position that is very contradictory with what others have said, and in fact is quite controversial. So why not say it here? We're among friends. I don't think that's their main objective. I think the threat of the bomb, has certainly gotten our attention. I am much more concerned by Iran's activities in Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon, and Iraq. Oh, by the way, Iraq. Oh, let's move on. Let's turn a page. Iraq, you know how we are. Iraq, what was that all about? I don't think we're anywhere near finished with Iraq, ladies and gentlemen. And when I talk about Iraq, it always gives me a chance to talk about Iceland. U.S. troops went into Iceland in 1941, obvious reasons. They didn't leave until 2006. Iceland. Do you think they're going to leave Iraq, where the stakes are so much higher and where the Iranians are going to be agitating? I am concerned about the bomb. The potential for miscalculation on the part of, say, a new Israeli government is quite high. On the other hand, I was born at night, but I wasn't born yesterday, all right? Let's put it that way. Iran is showing all the signs that Saddam Hussein showed, that he had all these weapons and he intended to use them. If the Iranians are playing a high-stake game, this is all the more reason, in my view, for dialogue, for discussions to begin. This is very controversial, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I think we have higher stakes now on the ground than in the air with nuclear bombs. So this will continue. And the Obama administration has its work cut out for it. I've actually negotiated with the Iranians. It's not a walk on the beach. I see a hand. I think, yeah. Yes, sir. Go ahead and I'll repeat it until we...
Could you elaborate a little more on Mubarak's position on Iraq now?
Position on Iraq? Look, the dirty little secret was that for countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, they did not like Saddam Hussein. In fact, there was a great deal of inter-Arab rivalry. But what they liked was Iran was here, Saudi Arabia and Egypt were here. If I had a third hand, I'd show you where, Iraq was the buffer. Okay? And what they said to themselves was, oh my God, you take away the buffer, there's nothing between Iran and us. Okay? And, oh, by the way, you are hearing those same echoes today in light of the Obama administration's interest in fashioning some form of a discussion or dialogue with Iran, which I happen to think is the right thing to do, albeit it'll be with some difficulty. So today, Mubarak's position, the government really hasn't spoken much about Iraq in the last several months. I think they're cautious, and I think they're a bit wary. I think they like the stability, but I guess the best way I can answer it is, what are they looking at the most closely? Iran. What's Iran going to do in Iraq? There's no relationship between Nouri al-Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq, and Hosni Mubarak. I think they may have met once or twice, but there's not yet a relationship. So Egypt is watching Iraq for the same reason other people should be watching it, and it is to see what the Iranians will be doing. I hope that comes close to an answer.
Okay, we have a question here, but could we see who else has questions so we can get the mics in place? Who else has questions?
Mr. Ambassador, one of the things that is absolutely critical to countries to be successful in the world today is having a sound financial banking system. I wonder if you could comment with respect to the impact on the global financial crisis on the banking system in Egypt, and how effective are they in dealing with their neighbors, financing transactions, and finally just with respect to Egypt as a market for U.S. goods right now?
Well, Egypt, the last part is the easiest part because U.S. trade with Egypt stands at about $8 billion. And in fact, we are, I think, each other country's leading trade partner. Egyptians are very keen to attract U.S. trade, and they're also keen to attract U.S. investment. And that has been working pretty well. On the financial side, Egypt has a secular banking structure. It is governed by what I think is the most capable finance minister. There are some aspects of Sharia banking, but that tends to be in Lower Egypt and more traditional areas. Egypt's credit rating, so far so good. It will decline as the value of their chief commodities go down. How they handle trade in the region, the vexing part of that is that there's very little intra-regional trade. The trade goes out. I mean, it's like a stovepipe that's horizontal. There's very little, vertical. There's very little horizontal trade that integrates the countries, and that's one of the great tragedies of any kind of European or Arab rather economic integration, a la the European Union. The Gulf countries announced a common market last year. It's limping along. It won't produce any results. Everybody is in, as they say in Egypt, the Nile, not the river. They are just hoping and praying they don't get hit. They know they're going to get hit, and they're hoping they don't get hit too hard. The Egyptian pound is still trading well, stable. The rates haven't changed. It's pegged to the dollar, and I think you could figure out at one point it helps, other points it hurts. But they're in for a rough ride. They are in for a very rough ride. And I can't give you a better answer as to the technicalities of the banking system because it's just been too long since I was involved with Egypt's financial sector. But that's the best I can do. I mean, their system in the last 5 years has performed quite well. They've got some very capable guys, both with European and American affiliates, but also internal banking. The Egyptians are good traders. They know their stuff. Now.
I'm over here.
Okay. Keep talking. I'll find you.
Okay. The Arab League was a fairly strong force back before the Iraqi war. Has the Iraqi war kind of destroyed any kind of unity in the Arab world, and what would it take to bring back some some leadership with the Arab League starting to take more active roles in the Middle East peace process and intercountry harmony, peace, Iraq, the whole gambit?
Well, the Arab League, the current Secretary General is a person I worked with when I was in Egypt, Amr Moussa. He became foreign minister and has now been at the Arab League for several years. Frankly, the Arab League has had a mixed track record. They have not been able to engage in much heavy lifting. They did not. The secret is that the Arab League has been unable to bring about solutions to problems. I'll give you one example, such as Lebanon. In Lebanon, the parties went to Doha, Qatar. The Qataris stepped up and began to negotiate. Another example, not quite directly to your question, but the Saudis have brought forth all of the Taliban. This is pertinent to today's headlines because President Obama has said he will reach out to the Taliban, some moderate elements. The Saudis have already done that. The chances of a robust, unified Arab League stance on issues such as the Palestine-Israel crisis are not good at all, given the rivalries that currently exist. What, however, has unified them, and again, I know this is sounding repetitive, but please know that I think that this really is a significant factor. What is unifying them is Iran. Now, when I say that, then I have to add, but on the other side, you have Syria. Syria has been an ally of Iran's now for 20 years. I call them the coalition of the trapped, but this is why efforts to negotiate or to have a dialogue with Syria are critical. More critical even will be Syria and Israel. If you ask my honest assessment of peace chances between Palestine and Israel, my answer would be I've never been more pessimistic than I am today. If you ask me where is a ray of optimism or light, I would say the possibilities of Syrian-Israeli discussion, certainly Syrian-United States. That's a possibility. But the Arab League will be on the sidelines as a cheerleader. During my time in Cairo and during my 7 or 8 visits back there, I've never seen the Arab League to be a really robust organization, other than a meeting place, and they do that. But on Gaza, for instance, the countries were split among themselves. The Egyptians didn't want to go to Qatar, and a lot of people didn't want to come to Cairo. And I think that you're going to, in other words, to make it short, you're going to see more of the same of these internal divisions. Again, another reason why the succession issue in Egypt is so critical. We don't know what kind of a leader we'll get out of that. For sure, he, and it will be a he, will not have anything like the experience, national security, defense, or foreign policy experience that Hosni Mubarak had.
Any more questions? Well, let me end with, okay, and then I've got, well, while you're walking over there, let me ask my question, because you mentioned something about it, Mark. President Mubarak routinely shows up on lists of who are the 10 worst dictators in the world. Is that a fair assessment? And if his son does take over, do you think, will he bring in a breath of fresh air, so to speak?
Yeah, that is a fair question. And I would not stand here for a second and say that the Mubarak government is without flaws and without blemishes and without serious problems. Indeed, all you have to do is to read the State Department's Human Rights Report, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, to see this for yourself. Whether he is one of the top 10 worst dictators, I think that's quite a stretch in my view. But I mean, maybe he's only 15. I don't know. But yes, there are some problems. Yes, there are some problems. But look at the lineup of problems that you have in the Middle East. And this is, I think, one of the mistakes that the Bush administration made in this heady atmosphere of 2004 and 2005. I think they reasoned, we have hit the bottom. And now we have Lebanon, we have Libya, and things are going to go our way. And so the democracy initiative was launched. Well, they didn't. They got worse. And if this engagement by Iran continues, they could well get worse again. What I'm saying is, you don't have a lot of options here in the Middle East. You're not going to call Yemen. You're not going to call the Tunisians, good as they may be. You've got Egypt, and you've got Saudi Arabia. Now, King Abdullah may be even higher on the list, right? Right? This is the Middle East today. This is what we have to deal with. And this is why it's important to keep going. If I were to give advice to the Obama administration, which I'm sure they're unlikely to ask, what I would say is do whatever it takes as quickly as you can to anchor relations with Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Full stop. Mindful of the problems that they have. Because you don't have a lot of those countries in that part of the world. And you're not going to get the job done with the Israelis, as valuable as that relationship has been over the years. So, yeah, there are the flaws, there are the criticisms, but to go to Egypt, I think you will see a different side of the country. And again, Egyptians crave stability. They really don't like rapid change. So, we have another question?
I was wondering how much the career foreign service personnel and the ambassadors to the various countries have input into policies that are set in Washington and influencing what we're doing in the various, where people are actually there on the ground knowing what's going on.
Well, that's an extremely important question, a very topical question as we get ready now to appoint a new series of ambassadors. Diplomacy is important, and I don't think good ambassadors ever get credit for the work that they do. I'll give you one example in Egypt. Our ambassador there was put on a hot spot both during the Iraq War. That was difficult in face of the Egyptian criticism. And also in explaining and defending the Bush administration's democracy policy. And what he did, and I think this began to resonate a lot better, he said, don't use the word democracy. This is a guy who's on the ground, who speaks Arabic, he knows the lay of the land. He talks to people, a dozen times a day. He said, don't use that word democracy. It's grating, they bristle at it. There is a word, though, that Muslims appreciate, and that word is justice. Justice. And so when President Bush and President Mubarak met, I think it was January 16th, a year ago at Sharm el-Sheikh, guess what? President Bush used the word justice. Maybe that's just a trivial, small example. But I think words resonate, and words have a weight throughout the Middle East. Where it is, I think, the role of the career service can be most helpful is in a lot of the technical issues, a lot of issues like development, for example. I know in my own career we were able to do things that Washington frankly didn't care about, and by showing some initiative. In fact, what I always did was to say, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm going to say. I'm going to be very upfront with you. If you don't like it, let me know. But if I don't hear anything, I'm going to do it. Because if you try and send a message to Washington and say, I'd like your advice on how I should behave, well, you know it's going to be snowing in Saudi Arabia by the time you get an answer. Sorry, I guess that's a little too indiscreet, isn't it? I think that the career officers in the field, if they're good, I'm babbling here. You've just seen an example of what a career ambassador can do, right? Ryan Crocker in Baghdad, Iraq. What he did in negotiating to bring these parties together is nothing short of inspirational. One other thing that people don't realize, what Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus, David Petraeus, have done is to fashion, I think, in my view, one of the closest diplomatic military relationships we've seen in recent my memory anyway. So here's an example of what a good career ambassador can do. The problem is that if you take those good career ambassadors and put them in Washington, I don't know what happens in Washington. That's a whole other story. It doesn't work quite as well. But I'm glad I remembered Ryan Crocker's example of the effectiveness of a career ambassador. And while you've got me going, let me just make one other point. Are you aware that since Korea and possibly certainly Vietnam, more ambassadors, both career and non-career, have been killed in the line of action than generals? Not many people are aware of that. So it's not exactly a kind of a cushy job. There's some real risks that go with it. So, Dixie, is that the last question, or?
If I could add one more.
Oh, sure.
I was wondering about Nasser during the 50s. We heard back then a lot of talk about pan-Arabism,
right,
pan-Arab society, and it just seems to have all gone away to nothing.
Yes.
And it makes me wonder if it was ever really there.
Yes.
Or what happened to it? Why? Or maybe that's not the question.
No,
why did it dissipate so quickly, for lack of a better?
Well, no, you're exactly right. No, it was the real deal. It was magnetic. It was captivating, and a lot of Egyptians of a certain generation still go back to that. I mean, it was part of the thing about that period in the 1950s. This was you had Sukarno in Indonesia, you had Lumumba in Africa, you had a whole group of charismatic, quote unquote, leaders who captured the imagination of their peoples, if for no other reason than that they were coming out of the colonial experience, and it was music to their ears, and they played it skillfully. In the case of Nasser, two things happened. One is that he made a total mess of the economy. He tried to make it into a rigid state, almost a Soviet system, and that began to cripple him. And then I think the main thing that caused pan-Arabism to collapse in the case of Nasser was that he was discredited in the eyes of his people for the humiliating defeat in the war with Israel of 1967. Absolutely a debacle from the standpoint of the Egyptians, and Nasser was responsible. And so I think from that period, you can argue, it may be a stretch, but you can argue that out of that, the Islamists started to gain some traction as an alternative. That they had another voice, they had a different message, and you certainly have seen this with the summer war of 2006 between Hezbollah and Israel, in which the Islamists managed to defend a small village on the border much better than the Israelis were able to take it over. And though I don't think this is an accurate assessment, Hamas claims that they were able to stand up to the might of the Israeli army in the recent Gaza affair. I don't believe that that's the case, but it plays that way in the street. And so from pan-Arabism, we've now moved into this cycle where the competition is between those who believe, the martyrs, people who believe that it's the most worthy thing you can do is to blow yourself up, and the moderates who say there has to be a better way of accommodation. But it's a profound question, actually, and I'm not doing it justice, but you're right. Yes, he lost power, and it was chiefly, I think, specifically triggered by the debacle of the 67 war, and then he died of a heart attack in 70.
Any more questions? Thank you, Ambassador Johnson.
Thank you, Dixie.
For Ambassador Johnson, we have a gift, autographed copy of Tom Jelton's book on Cuba. Dixie's already told you about the fact that this gentleman is available for tours if you're so inclined, and we have information out in the foyer. So I'd like to present this book. It's Tom Jelton's book, Bacardi and the Long Fight for Cuba.
That's a great treat. Thank
With
you so
great
much.
appreciation for your visit here.
This is wonderful. Thank you all very much. This is great.